Dr. Jeffrey Halstead has been Canandaigua's hometown dentist for more than 35 years, offering routine dental care as well as cosmetic dentistry, implants, and dentures by their highly trained and experienced staff. Visit them online at canandaiguadentistry.com or find them on Facebook and Instagram.
Do you want to know what's happening in the Finger Lakes? We do too. We're going in depth with decision makers in the heart of upstate New York to get the answers you need. From the team of FingerLakes1.com, this is Inside the FLX.
Welcome back to Inside the FLX. Today we are talking mental health, more specifically the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Deb Turner from Goodwill of the Finger Lakes joins me in studio. Deb, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a couple months.
Yeah.
The last time you were here, we were talking about 211. We've got a lot of number acronyms flying around now.
A lot, yeah.
So walk us through what 988 is.
Yeah, so 988 is a 3-digit dialing access number to what used to be known as the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So that's that 1-800-273-TALK. People may have heard the song by Logic. Mm-hmm. If you were present for the news around the deaths of Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade, you saw that number everywhere. Yeah. And there's been really kind of a rethinking of what that number needs to be, because the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline used to really kind of give off the sense of like you have to have thoughts of suicide to call. So really 988 is kind of a reset of that. It's really a 3-digit dialing access number that anyone can call 24/7 confidentially to get behavioral health support. So if someone is in crisis, they don't have to have thoughts of suicide to call. Someone may be struggling with a substance abuse issue. They may be struggling with a family member. They may just be struggling and need to talk. It's kind of opened up this messaging, this encouragement around, reach out before you get to thoughts of suicide, because that is also suicide prevention. Yeah. So that kind of rebranding, along with the FCC's mandate to put that number in place for people to access, has really opened that door for all these different kinds of issues people may be experiencing to reach out to and to get help for.
And we're talking about more than just a phone call, right? Like there's text and there's other means as well, but it kind of funnels everything in through one channel, right?
Yep. So when someone calls, chats, or texts, there's actually an option to be connected, like if you're a veteran, to the Veterans Crisis Hotline, because they can connect veterans with their benefits, more specific resources, and even issues connected to being a veteran. Active duty members. There's special sub-networks as well. There is a deaf and hard of hearing sub-network. There's a Spanish-speaking sub-network. There has been the development and the expansion of tribal communities, sub-networks. So there's a lot of these kind of special sub-networks now available for people.
And I think one of the questions that a lot of folks listening are going to have is like, where are they? Like, where are they? Where are these call centers where these calls are being routed to? They're all over, right?
They're all over. There's about 200 nationwide that answer all these calls. The goal, of course, is to make sure that you're getting connected to a local network. So there's been a lot of actually state dollars New York State. We've been very fortunate that the governor has taken this as a priority and is actually funding New York State to do some of this work. So that way we can keep, in particular, I can speak for New York State, to keep all those calls, chats, and texts as much in-state as possible. The overarching goal is that 90% of our calls, chats, and texts all stay within the state.
Is that like, how close is the state to that now? Does the state have any idea how close they are to that now, or?
Absolutely, yeah. We get monthly reports. We're very close. I mean, we've achieved 90% multiple months in a row. So I think we're doing really good.
It's there. Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about like the process. What actually happens, or how does it functionally work when 988 gets a call? Like, walk us through that process.
Yeah, so you'll call 988, and we cover really 9 counties, so that's our primary coverage area. There is some advocacy going on where we need to be able to function like a 911 center where it's geolocation. So it's using cell towers to triangulate and connect to a local crisis center versus using the first 3 digits of a phone number to connect us. That's something that's, we're advocating for. It seems like it's moving along within the legislation to make happen. So let's hope, knock on wood, that happens. But really when someone calls, it just starts with a conversation. We usually will greet ourselves and say, hey, National Lifeline, this is Deb speaking. Can you tell me what prompted your call today? And just starts with a conversation because we want to give space to that caller to just share what's going on. And we do ask questions. It's important that when we're talking with someone that we understand, are they currently safe? Are they in process of potentially taking their lives? So how we might work with someone that, it's thoughts, they haven't done anything to harm themselves versus someone who maybe already has taken a bunch of pills, that we would work with that caller in a different way.
Yeah.
We need to understand their safety level. There has been a lot of standardization that's been in place for crisis centers. So for example, we do have to ask certain questions. That's just something we've all agreed to as networks to make sure that when we understand someone's level of safety, that we can connect them to the right resource, we can provide them the best support. But hands down, if people want to remain anonymous, that's okay too. You don't have to share information with us if you aren't ready to. It just kind of helps us as crisis workers understand where someone is at in their crisis and how to help them stay safe. So that, I don't know if that answers fully your question.
Yeah, I'm curious. How do I would imagine one that'd be very stressful. That be working in that environment be very stressful.
Absolutely.
But two, I'm sort of curious, like how you go through that process, or how the team goes through that process of trying to identify the level of emergence in the situation, and also trying to walk around the delicate fact that not everybody will want to be completely forthright about what's happening in their immediate space.
Yeah, I mean, all we can do is go on what people tell us. So if you're telling us that, you haven't taken any action to take your life, we can only go off of what they tell us.
Yeah.
But most cases, we don't get a ton of people calling us already in that state. It's usually people who know something's wrong, or they're panicking, or they know they're in a deep state of depression and they need someone to talk to. Most of our contacts, our outcomes are just de-escalated on the call, which means that they just needed to talk to someone. These calls don't always result in sending a mobile crisis referral, referring to another behavioral health service or another human service like food, shelter, housing. That most of these calls are just people who need to talk to someone that's unbiased and empathetic. So it's a combination. I like to describe crisis counseling as an art form with some clinical questions involved.
Yeah. How often do folks call on behalf of other people? I would imagine occasionally you guys might get at least questions in that lane, a loved one or a family member or a friend who maybe is concerned about someone they're close to, and not really knowing where to, because not exactly knowing where to reach out, I would imagine could also be a bit of a stressful situation to be in.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say between 10 to 30% of our calls, that can be a third party who just doesn't know what to do with the situation. We
That's
get
not insignificant. Like that number is actually a lot higher than I would have thought it would be.
Yeah, we get a lot of people who are concerned about a loved one and they don't know how to have that conversation. We get professionals who call us who ask us to call and check in on someone. So, I mean, we do offer to reach out to that person they're concerned about if it's something they feel that would be helpful to them.
Yeah.
Because I appreciate that, sometimes you see signs. Like, you see signs something's wrong, distress is happening. You may see signs that potentially that person may be considering taking their life. There's a lot of layers, and people, I think, just want to feel reassured that they've done everything they can. And so we'll offer different things. We'll say, hey, we could do a 3-way call to help have this conversation. We can call them and have this conversation. I think if we do take that route, though, of if we call them, explaining that whatever that person discloses to us on that call, we can't share with you without their permission.
Yeah.
So, that happens. Sometimes parents, they just don't know what to do with their teen. They think they're struggling. And so we might help, if anything, provide support to even that third party who's undergoing all the stress, just trying to help this person. And, we'll also talk to them and make sure they're okay too.
How do you mentioned it off the top, and we've kind of like danced around it a bit here. How do you be prepared for the range of potential circumstances that you're going to hear about on the other end of the line? Like age demographics alone seem like it would be very complex, but how, with everything, you said there are a bunch of like silos essentially where you guys have specialists, I would assume, in different scenarios, but walk us through what that actually looks like for you guys managing that day to day.
That's I chuckle because the truth is you can never fully be prepared.
Yeah.
Like, we can get anything coming into that call line. And so sometimes even when we talk about the number of calls we'll handle between 1,000 to 1,200 calls a month, which may not seem significant in a traditional call center sense, but when you don't know what's going to be coming in the line, you don't know the outcome of that, you don't know how long that call is going to take to have those difficult conversations. But I think it boils down to training. It's encouraging our staff that you stay within this core curriculum of crisis counseling, of building trust and rapport, and that's where you start. And then you build off of that. We train our staff to approach circumstances with no judgment, because that's what's going to kind of help peel the layers of what is actually going on here. I think, too, it's also making sure that the staff have access to support staff. So, for example, something that we implemented within this last 2 years now, next month is our second anniversary of 988, which is a little crazy.
Congratulations.
We have unit leads that are available for consultation. Those unit leads and supervisors can jump in and listen to a call and help with coaching. We have a clinician, that could also potentially consult. We have supervisors, of course. That's another layer of support.
Sure.
But I think the truth is just training our staff that, trying to maintain as much calm as you can and active engagement on those calls is the best thing that's going to help us move through what those next steps need to be, whether it's a domestic violence situation, or it's an imminent risk situation, or it's a third-party situation. Yeah. You kind of just have to take it a step at a time and then go by what is the most pressing, concerning, dangerous issue in the forefront and working from there. So, if we have a situation where, sometimes we get a caller who is having both thoughts of suicide and homicide, we have to just take those steps of assessment to understand, what is the likelihood of someone acting on either of those? Yeah. And then what is happening right now? Are they, is the access to that means to take their life in front of them, or is it, in a different area of the house? So it's really just taking a step by step, focusing on what is the most pressing, dangerous thing that could happen, and working from there. So we don't have specialists per se, but we do have ongoing continuous education as well to try to address as much as we can those common circumstances that come up. Sometimes you get a call that is completely out of the blue, out of nowhere, just a mountain of all these difficult things going on that you just work through one of those things at a time. And it's always essential that we try to keep trust and rapport with that caller to keep that conversation going.
How do staff take care of themselves in that process? You mentioned 1,200 plus calls per month, obviously more than a half dozen counties. That's still a lot to be talking to people when they're at potentially their lowest, their toughest moment personally, to be living those experiences with them and trying to coach and help and be an ear. How do you prioritize your team's mental health through that process, and what tools do they use to keep themselves healthy?
Yeah, so I think even before we talk about what we do, I just got back from a national 988 conference, and this is something that all the centers are dealing with right now. There's been a lot of burnout, there's staff turnover. We've even noticed about an annual cadence of people deciding this isn't for me, this is too much, because there is a lot of residual trauma that can go on from taking calls, chats, or texts like this, of this nature. But I think, as an employer, we're trying to navigate what more do we need to be doing to support the staff, because right now what we do is, even on our supervisor's check-in checklist, we try to even standardize that to make sure that we're checking in about wellness, that we're checking in about, hey, you have a lot of PTO. Like, why don't we talk about you, like, taking some of it? Because there are telltale signs when someone is starting to get burnt out. Sure. And so we try to be proactive in helping people also understand what resources are in front of them. Are you aware of our employee assistance program that you can call in and get help and services and counseling services for? Are you aware of the process to take leave, if you need to do that? So we try to educate them on all the things in front of them, but we also have our clinician who acts in a role of support. So they're not a supervisor, that their main thing is to focus on how the staff are doing, their wellness, facilitating process groups. We've been having some conversations even like, maybe we need to start an employee events committee so that they can feel connected to each other. Maybe we need to talk about, like a book club. There are things as an employer that we're doing, and then now we're assessing from that 988 conference takeaways, what are other things that centers are doing? What are things we need to be doing? I think off the bat, something we're recognizing is needing more resources than we have to do the work. So hiring more staff, that's a big one. So we're going through this process of assessing, these are the things that we can do. These are the things we need more resources to do, and then advocating for those resources. And, Goodwill, I think, does the absolute best they can with providing support, providing safe spaces for people to go to and have those hard conversations, even just having people do burnout assessments on themselves. Like, how are you doing? And then what are things that are outside of work that you're doing? But there's also this recognition, and I feel like as a leadership team, we've been doing some research on what is actually burnout. Because when you think about even just the research available, it's all pretty new. Yeah. Like being 2 years into 988, it seems like a long time, but it's not. Like there's also research out there about healthcare settings and burnout and stressors and turnover. This is kind of some newer territory for us as centers to be dealing with is as 988 has gotten bigger and more comprehensive and more out there, and we've gotten more resources, we're able to assess like how those resources helped us and helped our staff to, okay, now what's the next step? What do we need to be doing now to be making sure that as an employer, we're doing everything we can to mitigate burnout? Because burnout is also about dealing with chronic stress in the workplace. Because it's not just, oh, do this thing outside of work. It's also, what are we doing and what can we be doing more of to support our team?
This, like so many other areas of healthcare, it seems when in doing some research before this, there's at least some thought that caseload max or that kind of system might be necessary down the road because of how widespread the mental health crisis obviously is to be getting the volume you're getting. Obviously, you've got the staffing challenge. You'd like to have more staff, but you don't necessarily have them. Does it seem like eventually this type of service could get to a point where it has to be managed that way, where there is a maximum number of calls or conversations that an operator could potentially have to or take in a 30-day span or whatever the window might be?
Yeah, I think it's possible. Yeah. I think it makes sense, especially as more research comes out about it. Yeah. I think, too, what's unique about our work is we don't always get to know, like, what happens after that caller hangs up with us. So we're getting kind of these little snippets of this is what's going on in their life, and then they don't always call us back. So we don't always know in the long term, like, what's been happening, whereas I think for mental health workers, they're case workers, so they follow this person's progress throughout however amount of time the program runs with them. And I think, too, like another implementation we want to do is follow-up. So helping kind of get that sense of how helpful was our service, like getting some of that feedback, which I think could also help our staff see very clearly, like, this is how your work is making an impact in the long term on these folks' lives.
Yeah. Getting back to 988, what would you say maybe one of the two biggest misconceptions are about what the service is versus what folks might think it is and just not necessarily knowing what you guys are really doing?
Yeah, I think there's two trains of thought on this. I think the most concerning to me is that there's a notion out there that we are like 911 and that someone will just show up after calling us. Mm-hmm. And that's not the case. Under 2% of our calls result in having to engage with emergency services because it's never our goal to just send someone out because someone is saying that they have thoughts of suicide, because we know there's so many layers to that. You can have thoughts but no plan. You can have thoughts but maybe your plan is passive, meaning like you necessarily won't do anything to yourself, but you'll be waiting for something to happen. Maybe it's you do have a plan, but the means isn't available to you. Or you do have a plan, the means are available to you, but you're willing to work with us to come up with a plan to limit your access to that means. That there's a whole spectrum of safety involved in how we work with people. And, I think people have had really bad traumatizing interactions with police, with mental health, with EDs, and it's just not our goal to send, that we want to respect that individual's autonomy to figure out what will work for them to stay safe. That's really our goal. And, we would not do a mobile crisis intake generally without anyone's consent, because we want them to be a part of that safety plan, and then what's going to help you get support in the long run. That's the win-win for us. We don't want to be involving police.
Yeah. When someone asks you what is the mental health crisis, this is a question I've asked every time we've had a conversation about mental health in any facet here. I've asked this question. When someone asks you what the mental health crisis is presently in this country, mm-hmm. How do you define it and how do you look at it?
That's a really good question. It's a long. I just chuckle because I feel like there's so many layers to that question. I think pre-pandemic there was a lot of things about how our culture defines someone's worth, from work. I think in the space of our work lives, there's a lot of identity tied up into that, into what we do is our worth. And, I think that was an underlying struggle. I think there wasn't an openness about burnout, what it is, what it isn't. There just wasn't a lot of information about that. I think the expectation that employers try to meet people where they're at in their struggle, like not talking about, like, hey, boss, I'm really struggling with this. That was not commonplace before the pandemic. I remember that.
Yeah.
I mean, I had a wonderful boss and mentor, so I could have those conversations, but I know that was not a norm at all. I think there's a lot of underlying issues, even with the mental health system. I think it's very complicated for people to navigate, so people getting help is just a really hard process sometimes. I think the way that our mental healthcare system is set up is just not as fully accessible for people that really need those services. I think the payment structure of it, all of that, is just really complicated. It's overly complicated. I think there's just lots of layers to this. And then I think the pandemic happened and, isolation, trauma, especially in your home, if there's things going on at home that, like domestic violence, I know was a huge issue during it's a huge issue, but during the pandemic, it was an even harder issue because you're all home together. And so there's more incidences that occur. I know that divorce rates went up because of the pandemic. There were financial implications of the pandemic. So I feel like the pandemic just caused this bubbling reaction of all these things that were stewing at the surface anyways. Mm-hmm. And it just launched them off the deep end of stress.
It was impossible to contain them after that.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So the reason why I've been asking this question is because there's, it seems like the more conversations we have about mental health here, we end up getting to this point in the conversation, we're just about there here, where me as the interviewer, I'm sitting here saying, I hear a lot of people say we've made a ton of progress over the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. And I agree. But I think the reality is still that a vast majority of people either don't know who they can talk to or simply feel like they cannot talk to the people who exist in their life presently or the systems that exist in place currently to address mental health related stuff. Does it feel like the progress has been overstated?
It's also a complicated question.
I don't mean to put you on the spot. It's just one of those really interesting kind of while I want to, the optimist in me wants to acknowledge yes, we've made a lot of progress. I also feel like we have so far to go because I think of the generational, and maybe you can speak to this a little better too, the generational divide between the things Gen Z and millennials are comfortable talking to their parents or, grandparents, I guess, Gen X or boomers about in terms of mental health. It's just there is a literal ocean between what those two groups are willing to talk about or can talk about. How much that has to create such a challenge in the work you guys do every day.
It certainly can. I think just to pop back into the last question, I think too what's caused this mental health crisis, particularly in the space of work, is people are recognizing their worth and what they're willing and not willing to do and put up with.
Yeah.
Toxic work environments that I have noticed and my team has noticed that Gen Zers are a lot more willing to speak up when they don't feel like something's right. And as a millennial, like that, like we've been told, go to college, work hard, you'll get everything you need and want. And that just hasn't happened all the time. Like I am so grateful for, the student loan forgiveness, because that has opened up a lot of opportunity for me and my family. Yeah. But we came out with a ton of debt. We came out with a lot of expectations that weren't met. And we have, I think, a lot of us, I don't want to speak for everyone, a lot of millennials I've interacted with were perfectionists. Like those TikToks that come out about like, oh, my boss wants to talk to me, I'm going to get fired. And it's like, it's like this panic.
Yeah.
But I get the sense too, just with a lot of Gen Zers, they're just not scared to speak up for what they see. I think too, the difference is that growing up, like we started to get on this track of having some language for mental health issues and struggles. Like I remember as a youth, like actually being taught about LGBTQ in health class, and mental health actually starting to be a part of that conversation. Signs that you might be in a domestic violence, like starting to come up.
Yeah.
And I feel like that level of education and understanding has exploded, and I can't help but think that it's tied to a lot of social media. That's also what's a stark difference is growing up for me, like I got a cell phone senior year of high school, and it was not a smartphone. It was a flip phone, like a Verizon flip phone, very simple. Mm-hmm. I could text and I had to call after 9, but this next generation, they've had access to such different technology than we have. And so I think they're in a lot of ways they're educated more than we were growing up. But I think too, there's also this level of overstimulation that's happened. There's this level of some insecurities that have grown because there's just so much information coming at them. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's like a spider web of like, this is kind of what I've been seeing and noticing and even seeing in the research and the data.
Yeah, incredibly well said. And I think it just points to how complex this is. And obviously, we have a billion different awareness months throughout the calendar year. But mental health in particular just can't be addressed in 130 because it's connected to every other socioeconomic issue that exists in this country. Okay, so let's get back to 988 specifically. How does it work, or how can it work in collaboration with, say, 211 or some of the other call centers or directories that folks might interact with?
Yeah, so I think at Goodwill, we're a bit of a unicorn because we are 211 and 988. So our team is aware, like, we have our own internal database that you can access and provide a referral to if that's a need that comes up in a call. But a lot of crisis centers and 211 centers have good working relationships with their local crisis centers and 211 centers. So, if there's a 988 center that they do have to have some kind of access to a directory, but they generally have kind of like a warm transfer process to a 211. So it may be like, okay, we're de-escalated, like, I appreciate you calling, how about we warm transfer you to 211, and then they can help you find those resources that you were asking about. Yeah. And so then that warm handoff process happens. So that's how I know other communities do it, but I think since we have it all kind of internally, that's really nice for us and for the caller.
It seems like that's the more logical and streamlined way to do it. Is there a reason why more don't do it that way, or that infrastructure doesn't exist in more places?
Running a 211 and 988, they're different. Yeah. Like we have 3 accreditations. And if you're a 211 center, you only need 1. So there's that layer too of like, there is just a lot more resources, considerations of why you would decide to run 2 in one place versus 1 in different spaces. Because they do really need their own different level of focus and priorities. Like like with 211, I work with partners on grants because it's really about connecting to resources available, versus 988 is a little different in that it's very focused on behavioral health. It's very focused on assessment, and those calls tend to be a bit more serious in mental health space. That's not to say there isn't crossover. Like, we get 211 calls that turn into crisis calls. So I can totally understand why people don't want to be doing both, because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of coordination, communication, making sure all these departments are talking to each other and collaborating. It is just a lot more work to run. That's my opinion. I haven't run like separately, so maybe I don't have that perspective, but I could see why it's easier in some senses to just silo those.
It seems like the depth of knowledge that would be necessary to do both, it would be significantly more. When you look forward and you think about whether it's legislation or whether it's maybe some kind of systemic change in healthcare or culture or something else, what is one thing on the horizon that kind of gives you some optimism about this whole thing? I want to kind of wrap on a positive note here if we can.
Yeah, I think, like Jerry Maguire, show me the money. There is money being devoted to these efforts, because 988 isn't just about like the call centers. It's also about money flowing down to support like more mobile crisis teams getting up and running, more mental health walk-in centers getting up and running, that we're just not, like, I'm from a larger perspective, I'm really grateful that I'm not just seeing, okay, here's the money crisis centers, but I'm also seeing resources trickling down from that. Because in the past, I think it's always felt like we were kind of the dumping ground for, they didn't know what to do with these people. And so seeing grants come out, seeing partners expand their hours, expand their resources because of these dollars, it's not just, okay, cool, we got them on the call, we de-escalated them, but how do we address the more long-term problem? And we're seeing that also start to emerge, that these systems are starting to talk to each other and have meaningful conversation, or even just some conflict. There's still some struggles with PSAPs or 911 centers getting on board with this idea of, hey, let 988 be a part of your plan to like transfer a call to us and let us take it over instead of you just automatically sending police. There's even some of that like friction and conversation happening, and that's encouraging to me.
Does that make you feel like you're closer to an even more unified system eventually? Because I think in a lot of ways it sounds like that's what we're headed towards, just a matter of how quickly we get there, where everything is more unified and there is a more delicate approach to how all situations like this are handled.
I would say we're getting closer. Absolutely. I think, like, even just having a conversation with my boss yesterday, like, 988's only 2 years old. Like, we're in the toddler stage.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not funny, but it's just this, we're still seeing like what we're able to do and accomplish. And there's a lot of really great crisis centers that are doing amazing work about like demonstrating that long-term impact of our services, and like rolling out new practices, rolling out new wellness programs for their staff that is showing results. And so I think even that's encouraging to me, that knowledge sharing is happening.
Yeah. Last question for you. Where can folks learn more, help Goodwill, and just kind of see all of the things you guys are doing?
Yeah, so we do have Twitter pages. We have Facebook page. We're on LinkedIn. I think it's always great to, follow those channels and just kind of see, what Goodwill is doing, because Goodwill, they are an incredible entity. I think, again, I give my leadership a lot of props. It is not easy to run a crisis center, and I don't know many Goodwills that do that. But we would not be able to do everything we do without the revenue generated from the stores. We even have manufacturing that generates revenue to support our community programs. Our program runs between a $600 to $700 deficit every year, and that is picked up by the revenue brought in by the stores. Like, it runs real lean. Like,
Sure.
and then we have other community programs. You know, we have a Good Neighbor program. We have community navigators housed at different stores. You know, we even have at the Rochester City Court, we have a community navigator housed there. It's called the CCD. That folks could, if they have a court appointment date and they need to go get resources, that they could go to and talk to and get help with. You know, we also have vision wellness programs. So we are doing, I feel like, so much, and people don't always connect that. You know, they connect it with, well, you know, like they make millions of dollars, and it's like, not really, because it all goes to these community programs. So
Yeah. It's all just barely getting by. It's all just barely held together.
I give my bosses a lot of kudos to how they make that all work. You know, like they make sure that we have as much as we can as far as resources go, and we know that there's more advocacy that has to happen to get us more resources. And so that's kind of the next stage of, I feel like, what I get to do is, okay, we know we need this much. Now how do we pay for it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Deb, thanks for coming in today. We really appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Inside the FLX. If you want to hear more conversations like this one, check out the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. For Paul Russo, I'm Josh Durso. We'll see you next time.